They said she could not read. That was the first lie. They said she was no one, a border girl brought in on a cart with the winter tribute. Her name written in the ledger beside 2 sacks of grain and a bolt of rough linen, as though she were cargo of comparable worth. That was the second lie. They did not know what she could read. And they did not know whose name was carved in the stone above them, in letters so old the scholars had stopped pretending they understood. They had stopped pretending 40 years before she arrived. But Senna had been reading the old script since she was 7 years old, tracing the characters her grandmother scratched into river clay before the fever took her, and she knew what the seal said. She had known from the moment she crossed the threshold of Vorath Keep. She had not said a word. What happens when the thing you have been hiding turns out to be the very thing the most feared king in the northern reaches has been searching for? Stay close. The answer does not come quietly. The year was 412 by the reckoning of the Pack Councils, the third winter since King Kaelin had taken Vorath by treaty and remade it in his own image, cold, ordered, unforgiving. They called it the Iron Year in the lowland villages, though no one would say it above a whisper within the keep walls. Kaelin did not forbid the name. He simply did not need to. His silence on the matter was permission enough for lesser alphas to enforce it on his behalf, and they did, eagerly, as lesser alphas always did. Senna arrived in the third week of deep frost, her wrists chafed from the rope that had loosely bound the tribute wagon's passengers, more ritual than restraint. She was 22 years old, lean from the river settlement's lean autumn, her dark hair bound back with a cord. The border headman had assessed her against the tribute quota and chosen her because she could cipher numbers well enough to be useful in the household accounts. He had not asked whether she could read anything else. No one ever asked. She was installed in the archive room before the first night was out, because the keep's archivist, an elderly man named Pereth, had fallen ill before the winter closed the roads, and the archive had not been touched in 4 months. There were papers threatening to mildew. There were ledgers with entries that trailed into illegibility. There were 3 locked chests of documents in the old script that no one alive in the keep could open, because no one alive in the keep could read the lock words pressed into the wood. Senna stood in the archive room that first night, holding a single candle, and she saw the locked chests, and she felt the cold gather in her chest the way it did when she was afraid of her own knowledge. She put the candle down on the ledger table and turned to the mildewed papers. She could deal with those instead. The loyal anchor in that room was not a person, but a stool near the brazier where Pereth had clearly spent his winters, worn smooth in the exact shape of a long occupation, with a small folded wool blanket tucked beneath the crossbar. Senna sat on that stool on her second night and decided, without quite knowing why, that she was going to keep it warm for whoever came back to it. Kaelin of Vorath was not what the lowland stories made him. The stories made him enormous, absolute, a walking catastrophe with a crown. The reality was a man of 31 who moved as though he had learned very young that the space around him was more dangerous than the space inside his own skin, and who spoke rarely and without ornament. He was tall. He was marked across the jaw with a scar she could see even from the width of the great hall, pale against sun-darkened skin, and his eyes were the gray of deep water in winter. He wore a circlet of dark iron set with a single amber stone, and his hands, when she saw them at the high table the morning after her arrival, were the hands of a man who had not always been a king, which meant he had fought his way there with them. He did not look at her at that morning meal. He did not look at her for the first 9 days. The court functioned around him like a mechanical thing, all its gears tipped toward his axis. His steward, a narrow man named Brecht, managed the human logistics of the keep with fastidious contempt for everyone he managed. Brecht was the one who told Senna that the archive was her assignment, that she was to produce a complete inventory of the uncatalogued holdings by the next full moon, and that the locked chests were not to be opened without the king's direct instruction. He has not given that instruction, Brecht said. In 3 years. Senna looked at the chests. Has he been asked? Brecht looked at her the way he looked at Flor Grime. The king does not need to be asked about things that are beneath his attention. She did not point out that 3 locked chests in his own archive were unlikely to be beneath his attention. She went back to the mildewed papers. What she had not told Brecht, or Perith, when he sent a note from his sickbed inquiring about progress, or the kitchen girl Marit who brought her evening meal and lingered to talk because the archive was warm, what she told no one was that she had already read the lock words on all 3 chests, and that one of them bore the seal of the House of Vorath in the old script. And that pressed into the wax beside the seal was a name she recognized, her own name, in the lettering her grandmother had taught her. The exact characters, in the exact sequence, that no one alive in this keep would know, meant Senna. She had pressed her thumb over the wax and stood very still for a long time, and then gone back to the mildewed papers. The cost of that silence was 9 days of ordinary archive work and 3 separate attempts by Brecht to have her reassigned to the scullery when she failed to produce the complete inventory fast enough for his satisfaction. The first time, she said nothing and went back to the ledgers. The second time, she handed him 6 pages of completed catalog entries and asked whether the new pace would suffice. The third time, he came into the archive with 2 men who were clearly intended as physical incentive, and Senna was standing at the tall shelving with an open ledger in her hands and did not put it down. It was the third time that Kaelin walked in. She did not know, afterward, whether he had been coming to the archive already or whether someone had alerted him. She only knew that Brecht's voice, mid-sentence and contemptuous, naming her as a tribute girl who thought herself above instruction, stopped as if a hand had closed around his throat. She turned. Kaelin stood in the archive doorway. He looked at Brecht. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at the ledger open in her hands. Something in the room changed, not loudly, not with visible magic, but as perceptibly as a change in air pressure before rain. Out, Kaelin said. Brecht left. The 2 men left. Kaelin stood in the doorway a moment longer, his eyes still on the ledger. She thought he was about to follow them. Instead, he said, without inflection, "How far into the catalog are you?" "A third of the uncatalogued holdings," she said. The mildewed materials were a longer repair than anticipated. He was quiet. She could not read the quiet, only its weight. "The chests," he said. She felt the cold gather in her chest again. "I have not opened them," she said, which was true. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time. She held the look the way she had learned to hold herself in cold water, still, not struggling, not panicking. His eyes moved over her face with an attention that was not the attention of a man cataloging a servant, and she did not know what it was, only that her pulse changed, and she did not understand why. "Finish the third," he said, and left. She put the ledger down and pressed both palms flat on the shelf for 3 slow breaths before she trusted herself to continue. She told Marit nothing. Marit was 17, good-natured, constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret, and Senna was fond of her in the way you were fond of a fire you knew might run uncontrolled if you fed it too much. She let Marit talk. She listened to the keep's social mechanics, who owed whom, which of the court wolves had aligned with Brecht's faction, which of the Outer Pack alphas had come to Vorath that winter for the council called the Frostmark Conclave. The conclave, Marit said, happened every 7 years. Kings submitted their lineage claims to a council of 6 elder alphas, and the council affirmed or challenged their right to hold. "The king's been fighting the challenge for 3 years, Marit said, setting down the evening tray. "They say his maternal line is disputed." Senna looked up from the ledger. "Disputed how?" "Someone destroyed the original lineage records." Marit lowered her voice. "Decades ago. Someone burned the archive at the old seat. There's a document that should exist and doesn't. The challenge is that his claim can't be verified without it. Senna said nothing. Marit said, "They say if he can't produce the lineage proof at the Frostmark Conclave, that is this year, end of winter, the council strips the title." The end of winter was 12 weeks away. Senna looked at the 3 locked chests for a long time after Marit left. The one with the Vorath seal. The name beside it, in the old script. That was her name. Her grandmother, who had taught her to read those characters, had come from the river settlements. The river settlements were what remained of the villages that had clustered near the old seat before the fire. She was still looking at the chests when she heard the archive door. She did not turn immediately, only said, "I have completed the third." "I know," Kaelin said. He was not coming from the door's direction. He was already inside, in the corner near the brazier, as if he had been there long enough that the room had accepted him. She turned. He was looking at the chests. "You know what the lock words say," he said. It was not a question. She considered the cost of the answer. She considered 12 weeks. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The air pressure again, that shift she could not name. "What does the seal say?" She crossed to the chest with the Vorath mark. She traced the characters slowly, one to the next, translating as she went in a voice she kept careful and even. She named his lineage. She named the line of descent. She read the date of sealing and the name of the witness who had pressed a secondary mark into the corner of the wax, and she felt him go very still at the name of the witness, the way you went still when something you had believed lost was suddenly in the room with you. "And the secondary mark beside the seal," he said. His voice was controlled. She could hear the control. She looked at the second name. Her own name. 8 characters in the old script that her grandmother had taught her in River Clay, that she had never seen written anywhere else, that she had not spoken aloud since the river settlement headman had sold her quota to the border tithe. "It is a name," she said. "Whose name?" She could feel her own heartbeat in her palms. "Mine." The silence after she said it was the longest silence she had spent in a room with another person. Kaelin did not move. She did not move. The brazier made its small crackling sound, and the candle flame tilted in a draught neither of them had caused, and she looked at her own name in the old wax and felt the cold settle into a different shape. Not fear, precisely, but the sensation of a weight she had been carrying for years shifting on her shoulders. "Your grandmother's name," he said finally, not asked. "She taught me the script." "Where did she learn it?" "She was born in the villages near the old seat, before the fire." Another silence. Then she heard him speak. "The witness mark is the stamp of the House Archivist of Vorath, the original line. The one who sealed this chest was the last keeper of the lineage records before the archive burned." He paused. "She would have sealed this chest 3 weeks before the fire." Senna looked at the wax. 3 weeks before the fire. Her grandmother, who had left the old seat at some point before Senna was born, who had lived the rest of her life in the river settlements teaching a girl to trace river clay characters as though it were simply something grandmothers did, as though she were preserving something in the only vessel available to her. "She did not tell me," Senna said. "No." His voice was different now, not softer exactly, but carrying a different weight. "She would not have. Not if she thought the knowledge might endanger you. If you are still here, listening, hold on. What comes next does not come gently." Senna turned to look at him. He was watching her with the kind of attention that had a name she did not yet have permission to give it. The mark above her name in the wax was a line of small characters she had not finished reading. She had stopped at her own name and gone no further. She went back to it now, tracing slowly, and the characters resolved into words, and the words resolved into a designation she had to read 3 times before she trusted her translation. "This is a lineage document," she said. "Not his lineage." "No," Kaelin said. "Mine." "Yes." She took her finger off the wax. She looked at him. Why is my lineage in a sealed chest in your archive? Because your grandmother sealed it there. Before she ran. He moved, finally, one careful step toward the chest. The Vorath family archivist was not simply a keeper of records. The position was bound to a specific bloodline. One that could read the old script. One that could authenticate lineage claims in the old notation that the council recognized as unimpeachable. He stopped. The position was hereditary. It could not be held by someone outside the blood, and it has been vacant since the fire. The cold in her chest changed shape again. She thought of Brecht telling her the 3 chests had not been opened in 3 years. She thought of 12 weeks. The Frostmark Conclave, she said. The council will not accept a lineage claim authenticated in the common script by a common record keeper. They have a right, under the old compact, to demand authentication in the old notation by the House Archivist of Record. He looked at the chest. There has been no archivist of record since the fire. The council has been using that fact to challenge me for 3 years. She looked at her own name in the wax. 8 characters. The thing her grandmother had sealed here. The thing she had carried from the burning archive and hidden in the only place she trusted, then run south and taught a child to read, as though the child might someday need to find her way back. She left me a key, Senna said very quietly, and never told me what the door was. Brecht's faction moved in the 4th week of deep frost, and they moved quickly once they understood what was in the chest. She did not know who told him. She thought it was one of the 2 court wolves who had been in the archive doorway the day Kaelin dismissed them, that one or both had listened longer than the dismissal warranted. However, the information passed. Brecht knew within 48 hours that the archive girl could read the old script and that the sealed chest held a lineage document and a house archivist designation. He knew what that meant for the Frostmark Conclave. The first action was the simplest. He had her removed from the archive on administrative grounds, a fabricated accounting discrepancy in the ledgers she had catalogued, and placed under a kind of loose, unspoken house arrest in the outer servants' quarters, a cold corridor with a door that stuck in its frame and 2 of his men at the end of the hall. Marit brought her the evening meal and sat on the floor beside the narrow cot and kept her voice low. They're saying you falsified the ledger entries. The king hasn't been told. Brecht handles this kind of thing before it reaches him. Has Perith been told? The archivist? Perith is still sick. Senna sat with her hands in her lap. She thought about the chest, now locked again, presumably moved. She thought about 12 weeks, and then she thought it was probably now 10 weeks. She thought about her grandmother sealing a document in old wax and running south, about a girl who had grown up thinking she was learning a dead language for no reason except that grandmothers sometimes did inexplicable things. Marit, she said, I need you to carry a message. The message reached Kaelin through his beta, a compact man named Davon who ran the king's household with the kind of quiet competence that Brecht only performed. Marit carried it to Devon because Senna had watched Marit's social geography long enough to know that Marit's cousin worked in the stable where Devon's morning came and went, and the connection held. The message was 4 words in the old script, written on the margin of the cloth she tore from the hem of her second-best dress. She had no parchment, no ink, only a bit of charred stick from the small brazier in the corridor. 4 words, in the old script, meaning only this. The house seal stands. What Brecht had not accounted for, and what small men who operated through administrative contempt rarely accounted for, was that the thing he was trying to suppress was not evidence of a discrepancy, but evidence of its own origin. The chest had not moved. She knew this because Maret reported, 2 hours after the message was sent, that Devon had gone to the archive and that the archive door was now guarded by Kaelin's own men. What Brecht had also not accounted for was Perith. The archivist arrived at the servants' corridor on the 6th day of Senna's confinement, wrapped in a wool blanket and looking like a man who had left a sickbed before it was entirely safe to do so. He was 63 years old, small-framed, with the permanently ink-stained fingers of someone who had spent his life in documents. He looked at the stuck door and the two men at the end of the hall, and then he looked at Senna, who had come to the threshold when she heard the footsteps. "You catalogued a third of the uncatalogued holdings in 9 days," he said. "Yes." "And you can read the chests." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother knew your grandmother," he said. "I did not realize it until I read the inventory pages you left on the table. Your handwriting. The way you form certain characters in the catalog headings." He looked at his own stained fingers. "There is a shape to the old script that is not entirely translatable to the common hand. You carry it." She carried it. Senna looked at him. "She knew what she was leaving me." "Yes." He pulled the wool blanket tighter. "As did I, once I was old enough to understand. I have been the only person in this keep for 3 years who knew the lineage document existed. I did not know where your grandmother had hidden it until you arrived and I saw your handwriting." He paused. "I was afraid to act. I am sorry for that." She thought of a stool worn smooth by someone else's winters. She said, "You came now. I came now." He agreed. The Frostmark conclave opened on the first night of hard frost, 63 days after Senna arrived in the tribute wagon. The great hall of Vorath Keep was packed with the 6 elder alphas of the council, their households, and the attending court, near 300 bodies in a stone room lit by 12 torch sconces, cold pressing in through the high slit windows, the assembly's breath making a low collective mist. Brecht sat at the council table in the position of household steward, which gave him the right of presentation. He had spent 63 days dismantling the ground beneath her. The challenge was formal and elaborate. The council's senior member, an old alpha named Roth, white-haired and sharp-eyed, read the lineage dispute into the record. The absence of the archivist position, the absence of authenticated documentation in the old notation, the absence of a continuous lineage chain that the council could accept as unimpeachable. Brecht watched all of this with the expression of a man who has counted his pieces and found them sufficient. Senna stood at the back of the hall in the cluster of the keep household. She was not a titled member of the assembly. She had no standing at the council table. She was a tribute girl from the border settlements, and Brecht had been explicit, in his last communication through his men, that she was to understand her status clearly. Kalen sat at the head of the table, in the carved chair of the Vorath seat, and said nothing while Roth read the challenge. His hands rested on the chair arms. She watched his hands, the stillness of them, and the old knowledge in the scar tissue along the knuckles. He was waiting. She understood, watching him, that he had always been waiting. That the 3 locked chests had sat unopened for 3 years not because he had forgotten them, but because he had waited for the key to appear. He had known, or suspected, or hoped. And she had arrived in the tribute wagon without knowing she was a key at all. Roth finished the challenge. Brecht spoke. He presented the absence as fact, the impossibility of authentication as structural, the stripped title as the council's only option. Kalen said, "The House Archivist of Record is present in this hall." The silence was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a room where every person understood that something was about to change, and none of them was quite prepared for it. Brecht's expression shifted by a fraction, the fraction where certainty recalculated against a variable it had not accounted for. Perith moved through the assembly, and Senna moved with him. They reached the council table together, the old archivist and the border girl, and Roth looked at them with the precise attention of a man who had spent 80 years in rooms where the truth came from unexpected quarters and had learned not to waste time on surprise. Perith presented the credentials. Senna's family line, the hereditary archivist designation, the document her grandmother had sealed in the chest with the Vorath mark. He laid the opened chest document on the table before Roth and spoke the lineage in common speech, then turned to Senna. She read it in the old script. Her voice was even. She had been practicing evenness since she was 7 years old, and she had had 63 days in this keep to understand that evenness was what she had instead of rank. She read the lineage from the top of the document to the base, every character in the sequence her grandmother had taught her, the words resolving into a chain that placed Kaylin's maternal descent squarely within the compact's recognized bloodlines and traced it through 8 generations without a gap. Brecht said, "The girl has no standing to authenticate. She is a tribute article." Roth looked at the document. The designation is hereditary and bloodbound. Standing is conferred by the bloodline, not by the title's vacancy. He looked at Brecht. Where in the old compact does it say the archivist must be currently seated to exercise the function? Brecht was quiet. "I cannot find that provision," Roth said, "because it does not exist." The room made a sound, not loud, a distributed exhalation of 300 people recalibrating. Senna stood at the council table and looked at nothing in particular, and felt the weight on her shoulders settle into an entirely different configuration. What she did not expect was what came next. Kaylin stood. He stood from the carved chair of the Vorath seat, in the full assembly, before the 6 elder alphas and their households and the entire court, and he crossed the width of the table not toward Roth, but toward her. The room went very still. He stopped on the other side of the table from her, 6 elders of the council between them and also nothing between them at all, and he looked at her across the documents and the candles and the 63 days since she had arrived, not knowing what she carried. He said, "You could have opened the chest on the first night." She said, "Yes." "Why did you not?" She thought of the cold gathering in her chest the first time she saw her name in the old wax. She thought of all the ways this knowledge had been dangerous since the moment her grandmother ran south from the burning archive. She thought of 9 days of mildewed papers, ordinary and careful. "I was afraid of what I knew," she said, "and I did not yet know what you would do with it." He came around the end of the table. Not fast, not performing the movement for the room, simply crossing the distance as though it had always been crossable, and he had simply been on the other side of it. He stopped in front of her. His eyes were the gray of deep winter water, and they held her with an attention she now had a name for, or nearly. The word was still arriving, but she could feel its shape. He held out his hand, open, palm up, like an offering rather than a command. "Then stay," he said, "so you can see." She put her hand in his. The contact was what she had no language for, not the spark of story and legend, not a visible light, but a shift in the room's gravity that she felt in her sternum before she felt it anywhere else. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. He did not look away from her face. Brecht said something. She did not hear it clearly, only the shape of it. Contempt taking one last breath before the air ran out of it. Roth said, from the council head, "The lineage is authenticated. The challenge is dismissed." He looked at Brecht across the table, old eyes and very clear. "On the matter of the steward's conduct during the confinement of the house archivist, I will want a full account." Brecht's faction did not hold the night. 2 of his men walked out in the first hour. 3 more by morning. Brecht himself, stripped of the stewardship before the torch sconces burned down, stood in the hall with the expression of a man who has spent his life certain that small people were interchangeable and has discovered, too late, that he was wrong about who was small. Devon escorted him from the keep before the first light. The council session lasted until long past midnight, the elder alphas ratifying the lineage chain in the common record and sealing the authentication in the old script with a wax stamp. Senna pressed herself, the mark of the house archivist of Vorath, renewed after 40 years' vacancy. Roth watched her press the seal and said nothing, only inclined his head slightly when she met his eyes, the acknowledgement of a man who knew what 40 years of absence meant and was pleased that the chair had been refilled. Perith sat in the corner of the hall in a chair someone had found for him and fell asleep before the session ended, his blanket pulled up to his chin, his ink-stained hands folded in his lap. She looked at him across the room and felt something ease in her chest that had been tightened since the first night she sat at his worn stool and decided to keep it warm. The archive was restored to her the next morning, and the 3 chests were returned to their shelves. 2 of them were still locked. She opened them in order, methodically, and catalogued their contents over the following 3 days, and what she found in them was not a surprise, but a confirmation. The records her grandmother had sealed there were the complete lineage holdings of the old Vorath seat, everything that had survived the fire because one archivist had packed it into 3 chests and locked them before she ran. Kaylin came to the archive on the 3rd evening. She heard him in the doorway and did not turn from the shelves, only said, "The second chest is the family council records from 200 years before the fire. The 3rd is the birth registry for the outer settlements from the same period." "I know," he said. "You knew what was in them." "I suspected." She turned. He was in the doorway the same way he had been that first time, the same stone and torchlight, the same stillness that the room organized around. He was not wearing the iron circlet. She had seen him without it only twice, and without it he looked like a man rather than a fixed point of power, which she found, to her own surprise, was not less formidable. "You waited 3 years for the right person to arrive," she said. "I waited for the person who already had the key," he said, and who had the judgment to wait until she understood what she was holding. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother running south with a girl's future locked in 3 chests and a language pressed into river clay. She thought about 63 days of mildewed papers and a name in old wax. She thought about the warmth of his hand in the full assembly and the word that had been arriving since that moment and had now, in the quiet of the archive, fully landed. She said, "Perith will need an assistant archivist. The catalog is extensive." "Yes," Kaylin said. I am not a tribute article." "No," he said. "You are not." He stepped into the archive and crossed the room, stopping not at the full distance, but in the space where the candlelight from her working table reached his face. "The archivist's position carries a seat at the council table, by the old compact." "I read that provision," she said, "in the second chest." Something moved in his expression, brief and unguarded. It might have been the beginning of a thing she had seen almost start a dozen times in 63 days, an expression she recognized now as the mask deciding whether to hold. It did not hold. He said quietly, with the careful precision of a man who has measured every word he has ever spent in company and is spending this one deliberately. "I would like you to stay. Not for the compact. Not for the council seat. Because the archive is warmer when you are in it. And I have spent 3 years in a keep that felt like it was missing something I could not name." She held that for a moment. The candle tilted in the draft. Somewhere in the keep, a door closed. She said, "You should have better windows. The draft is ruining the older parchments." He looked at her. She said, "I will stay." The windows were improved by the end of the thaw season. Kaylin arranged it without her asking twice, which she noted without comment but did not forget. Perith recovered fully by the time the outer settlement's birth registry was catalogued, and he came back to his stool by the brazier and found Senna at the tall shelves, and said only, "You kept it warm." And she said, "Someone had to." And that was the whole of that conversation. The Frostmark Conclave's formal record was sealed in the 4th week of Hardfrost's end, the lineage chain ratified by all 6 elder alphas in a document that bore the House Archivist's mark, her mark, in the old script. Roth signed it last and sent a note in his own hand that read only, "The compact is satisfied." She kept the note in the second drawer of the archivist's desk. Marit was promoted from kitchen girl to household assistant in the spring rotation, which she received with enough joy that she hugged Senna in the archive and knocked an entire shelf of unbound papers to the floor. And the apology was so elaborate that Senna had to firmly instruct her to stop before the papers were reshelved. Marit stopped. Mostly. The council seat, when she first sat in it, felt like the inside of the compact made physical, cold stone and old wood, and the smell of tallow and authority. She sat in it the way she had sat on Perith's stool, straight and attentive, prepared to stay as long as the work required. Kalen was at the head of the table. He looked at her when she took her seat, and the look was brief, and held something she could read now, the same way she could read the old script, with the comprehension that came from long attention and the willingness to stay in a room long enough for the meaning to arrive. She had one thing in the drawer of the archivist's desk that had not been there before she came. It was a small square of cloth with 4 words in charred stick on the margin. Old script, pressed smooth under a flat river stone she had carried from the settlements without quite knowing why. The house seal stands. She had written it to him. He had sent it back through Devon with a second line added beneath in the same notation, in a hand that was not trained but determined, that told her he had spent those 12 weeks learning something for reasons he was unwilling to leave inarticulate. The second line read, in the same careful hand, and so does she. She left it in the drawer where she could find it on the days when the archive was cold, and the wind came through the high windows, and the work was long, and the world outside the keep walls did not yet fully understand what had changed inside it. On those days she opened the drawer and looked at the cloth, and felt the warmth of it, which was not the warmth of a fire, but the warmth of a thing permanently settled. The window latch on the north wall of the archive caught on a cold morning, and she stood on the stool to reach it, and Kalen came in and held the stool steady without being asked, and when she came down from it, he did not step back. She looked at him in the morning light, gray eyes and the old scar and the dark iron circlet and the hands of a man who had fought his way to the place he stood, and had been standing alone in it for longer than she thought either of them had fully named. She did not step back either. The latch held.